When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Glowing Man. User: PNT Fielder. Posted October 12, 1997.
Baseball and I have a love-hate relationship in a lot of ways. This strike is definitely part of the hate bit. I used to play in the Mets farm system, and we got peanuts. We played because we loved playing. These guys hit the picket line because they can't afford their own personal pillow fluffer or whatever it is. It's embarrassing, and the sport is suffering because of it. But I'm not writing to talk about the strike. Not really. It just reminded me of my days on the fields, and thinking about those days, you have to think about those nights, too. The Pompano Beach Mets were part of the Mets farm system from '69 to '73, and I played there the last 2 years under Gordy McKenzie. Gordy was just getting his feet under him as a manager in those days. He was only a couple years out of his own playing career in the minors and had managed a couple of years for the Geneva Senators before coming out to the Florida State League. Now, I'd like to keep my own name out of this, but I suppose if someone dug up the Pompano Beach roster from around that time, they could figure it out on their own. Besides, the Mets drafted me out of high school and sent me to Pompano Beach right away. I had a head full of dreams back then and thought if I proved myself, I'd be down there for maybe a season or two. Instead, I blew out my knee when some short-timer from the Miami Orioles plowed into me at home plate instead of sliding. That was the end of my baseball career, and I spent a couple low years because of it, but I still love the game and watch every chance I get. I'm not here to tell you about baseball, though. I'm here to tell you about the mist I saw in my last year with the Mets. The mist that I think cost my girl her life. Pompano Beach wasn't much then. It isn't much now, come to think, but the boys on the club knew how to have a good time. Some of us had family back home, wherever home was, but that didn't stop anyone from having a local girlfriend, too. My girl was named Hildy, and she worked at the J.C. Penney in the old-fashioned square. Hildy was tall for a girl and slim like Twiggy. She had long red hair that went halfway down her back and lots of other qualities that wouldn't be right to go on about now. She was pretty, though. Let's leave it at that. I was renting a little house on Sailfish Place, and on home game nights, Hildy would come over after work. She wasn't a hippie. Those days were over by then, but she was into spiritual stuff and would sometimes tell me that my house had bad vibes. I never noticed one way or another, but she'd get mad if I didn't play along, so I would agree with her. Every now and then, she'd bring up the idea of me moving to somewhere that felt better, but it never got very far. I wasn't home enough to make it worth the bother, and deep down, I thought it was a lot of crap. There isn't a day, though, that goes by I don't wonder whether or not she'd still be alive if I'd listened to her. It happened on game day. Ron Hodgins, who had joined the team at the same time as me, got us on the board with a third-inning homer and another in the seventh to pull us ahead. The Tarpons never caught up and we won 3-2. After the game, a bunch of the boys headed over to Harris Imperial House for Chinese. The owner, Sam Harris, was a good man who didn't mind a bunch of rowdy ball players crowding up his establishment, so long as we didn't bother his girls too much, and we tipped well. Well, we overdid it in all the ways as you can at a place like that, and by the time I got home, I was practically rolling and more than a little sauced. I'd sobered up some by the time Hildy got off work, but even so, I wasn't good for much apart from sitting on the couch and watching TV, so that's what we did. We got through Cannon and Kojak before deciding to hit the hay. I turned off the TV, Hildy leaned over to turn off the lamp, and we talked while walking toward the bedroom together in the dark. This was our routine, and we'd done it so many times we could have made it with our eyes closed. We were in that hallway, maybe 5 feet from the bedroom door, when this mist started to form in front of us. It's just like the mist we used to get in Half Moon Bay when I was a kid, rolling in thick and quick, like you'd suddenly found yourself on another world. Unlike those mists, though, this one started to swirl and glow in a way I'd never seen before and hadn't since. The food and booze must have been slowing me down because Hildy saw it first. She shouted my name and I blinked out of whatever trance I'd been in to see that mist had formed into the shape of a glowing man. He had no face, but its outline was unmistakable. Before I could react, the glowing man reached one of his long arms out toward Hildy and touched her belly just below her sternum, then vanished. As soon as he did, she fainted dead away, and a moment later, so did I. It was maybe 5 a.m. when we woke up and crawled into bed. We never talked about it afterward, but it drove a kind of wedge between us because Hildy came by less and less after that. Maybe 3 months later or so, she stopped returning my calls completely. And a month after that, I heard through one of her friends that she was in the hospital with stomach cancer. She lasted less than a year, and coincidentally or maybe not, I don't know, around that same time, the Mets folded up the Pompano Beach Club and I was traded. I haven't physically seen the house on Sailfish Place in more than 20 years, but I dream about it still. And every time I do, I wonder when the glowing man will come for me too.
Subject: Invisible Intruder. User: MSY409. Posted May 8, 1996.
I don't know much about ghosts and such, but I do know that I've seen some stuff that doesn't make any sense without that explanation. It used to be something we'd talk about at big family get-togethers, but until I moved back in with my auntie last year, I didn't have any personal experience. My family originally came up in Detroit and Brightmoor, and in case anyone wants to ask, yes, it's as bad as they say. My dad used to own a laundromat east of Telegraph Road, and he used to tell me that back then, when things went wrong, you were better off relying on the bike gangs to take care of you than you were the police. We moved away when I was young, and I spent almost 20 years living in the suburbs of Chicago, which is a very different life. We'd talk to my cousins back home pretty regularly, and they used to tease me by calling me soft. I never thought much about it until I moved back to help take care of my auntie Janine, who had cancer. She's gone now, but Aunt Janine lived in Brightmoor right up until the end, in a little house near the old 8th Precinct police station on Grand River. When I was little, I always thought that building looked like a fairy tale castle, but now that it's closed, it looks more like a haunted house. Speaking of haunted houses, I remember Auntie telling me that There were ghosts in her place, but not to pay them any mind. I figured it was just the sickness or something talking, but then I started to notice some strange things. There were a few times when I was coming home from work at night and my bedroom light would be on. I'd ask Auntie what she needed in my room, and she always said she'd never been in there. She wasn't very mobile by this point, so it was hard to imagine her going in there for kicks, but I couldn't explain it otherwise. I also thought she was leaving the bathroom taps on, since I'd find them running at all hours of the day and night. But then it reached a point where I had to help her to and from the toilet, and it kept happening. No matter how much I tightened those taps, they turned themselves back on at random points in the night. It got real weird when I heard the taps turn on, then off. All the while, Auntie was in bed and I was sitting alone in the living room. The toilet started flushing itself too. Once Auntie reached the point where she needed help just getting around, she started spending most of her time sleeping. I'd make her food and bring her tea, but most of the time, she could only eat a bite or two. Between work and looking after her, it took me a little while to notice things moving. It started off small. A glass I was sure I'd left next to the sink was in the cupboard instead. Butter knives would go missing, only to turn up in the upstairs bathroom. It progressed to candles, and that's when I really started to take notice. The big candelabra from the dining room table somehow moved itself to the bathroom while Auntie was napping. My paperback copy of Big Sur, which I'd left on my bedside table, was ripped in half clean down the spine and left in my closet. I couldn't understand how all this was happening and wondered if someone was breaking in. The problem with that theory was that the house was as secure as it could be. The doors were thick and heavy, and all the windows had iron gates bolted over top of them. I started setting up little traps to catch anyone who might be coming in. Nothing deadly, just stuff that would make noise if anyone tripped them. No one did, but things kept moving. The toilet kept flushing, the taps kept turning on, and I started hearing footsteps. Whatever floor I wasn't on, the footsteps would be coming from the other one. When the doorknob thing happened, I had no choice but to admit to myself, even if to no one else, that I was dealing with ghosts. You need to understand that people don't usually walk around Brightmoor, and even if they do, they don't go further than a block or two away from their house, and you really don't go out walking at night. All this means is if you're going to get visitors, you expect to hear their car arriving first. Random door knocks are not a good sign. That night, around 10 p.m., someone started pounding on the front door of Auntie's house. When I first moved back, my cousin Patrice showed me where Auntie's gun was at. And I guess as far as guns go, it was just a little thing, a .22 caliber Beretta, but I had zero experience with guns or how to use them. Like I said, I grew up in the burbs where you could leave your bike on the lawn overnight, and half the time, my dad didn't even bother locking his car. I tried making a joke about accidentally shooting myself, but Patrice didn't laugh. He told me that if someone tried to get in, I needed to be able to protect Auntie Janine and myself, and that meant learning how to use a gun. It was a quick lesson, but I never forgot it. Open the lockbox, flick the safety off, don't put your finger on the trigger unless you're ready to use it. When the pounding started, I surprised myself at how quickly I was able to shake off the fear and run upstairs to get the gun. It was so fast, I don't even remember the trip back down to the door. It was like I was just suddenly back there, and whoever was on the other side was hitting it so hard it was shaking in its frame. The doorknob began jiggling furiously like someone was trying to wrench it open, and I shouted out a warning that I had a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. But the would-be intruder kept hammering. They were dead set on getting inside. I was flying on adrenaline. I couldn't legally shoot through the door, I thought, but would I be fast enough if they got through the door? And what if there was more than one? The only way you could see the porch from inside the house was through the living room window. I needed to know what I was dealing with, and the door had held this long, so I tiptoed down the foyer and crept up to the living room drapes, pulling them aside. I gasped. The furious beating on the front door hadn't let up at all, and I could still hear the doorknob shaking, but there was no one outside. It was like the whole world tilted sideways, and I lost my balance, hitting my head on the end of the sofa as I went down. When I woke up, hours had passed, and it was all over. The door was closed, Auntie was still asleep, and aside from a bump on my head, I was fine. Strange things kept happening in Auntie Janine's house, right up until she died. But the invisible intruder, or attempted intruder, I guess, never came back.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.